Let me just give you some background to the two talks I'm going to be giving today. Throughout my psychoanalytic training, I always felt like there was some way that I was talking with patients and trying to help them appreciate what it was that they were struggling with. I always found that I felt there was no particular theory or way of thinking that we had, that at least I knew of at the time, that could help me help my patients with bringing the conflicts that they struggle with to their awareness. And I felt like my teachers, my supervisors were experts at understanding the deepest dynamics of what patients were talking about. But how to translate that into something useful for a patient that they could use at the moment was something I struggled with and wondered about, and so after immersing myself in doing psychoanalysis for a number of years, I started to write some about this particular issue. There are really two major issues that I've been writing about. One is the whole issue of how we deal with patients' resistances to treatment. I felt, resistance is ubiquitous. It's something that's always expected, and yet I didn't feel like our methods of dealing with resistances were all that helpful to patients. We had a theory for how to do it, but I don't think the theory was really well integrated into the practice. So in 1982, actually, I read a paper by this fellow Paul Gray who talked about working with resistances, and it stayed with me, and it was about 10 years later that I started writing about that particular issue. So that's one area. The whole idea behind resistance analysis is really to help patients become freer to know and explore their own mind, which to me is what analysis is about. It's helping people to get free from what it is that they're caught up in. That's one area. The other area was I started to be interested in was this issue of how do we talk to patients at that level that I can't remember, maybe it was Fenichel who said it, that's deep enough but not too superficial so that they can understand something new about themselves, but not something that's going to create too much anxiety so they can't accept what it is that you might have understood about them. It seems like a relatively simple topic, but it just preoccupied me for the last 10 years or so. Anyway, this paper, Talking with Strangers, is an attempt to put in a metaphorical terms a way of conceptualizing what this issue is about in terms of talking with somebody about something that they're not quite aware of, that they're uncomfortable with. That Talking with Strangers became a metaphor as a way of explaining what this is, and not too much jargony language. So that's what the paper is about. Excuse me, let me just get some water. So I'm just going to read you a quote from Camus' the Stranger, that I'll refer back to as the paper goes on. He says, "There are some things I've never liked talking about. A few days after entering prison, I realized that I wouldn't like talking about this part of my life." I'll return to that. You are on a train from Vienna to Zurich when someone takes a seat in your compartment. The person looks interesting to you, and you briefly nod to each other as he sits down. You are interested in talking with your compartment companion, but in appreciation of the individual space of another, you mention something that commits neither of you to further conversation: the weather, the crowds at the station. You then evaluate your companion's response in determining whether your observation was the beginning or the end of a conversation. Does your companion give you a peremptory nod and turn quickly away to find his newspaper? Or does he smile and offer his own observation? Is your companion's smile genuine, or the thin-lipped smile of someone brought up to be polite? As you can see, when interacting with a stranger, we are continually evaluating the degree to which he is protective of his personal space. One way to conceptualize psychoanalysis is that at any one moment, there are many strangers in the room. The patient is a stranger to many parts of himself. In a successful analysis, the patient continues to bring in new parts of himself that are strangers to the analyst. Inevitably, the analyst also finds himself discovering aspects to which he has been a stranger in the analysis. It is my impression the techniques used by many of us assumes a greater familiarity with the strangers who haven't entered the room, and thus may never fully do so. Put another way, I don't think we pay enough attention to patients' needs to protect themselves from the strangers within. Throughout analysis, the awareness of these strangers is associated with extreme psychic danger, like self-annihilation, abandonment, loss of love, castration. Thus, in contrast to Freud's earliest beliefs, awareness of these strangers is fraught with dangers rather than freeing. Like Meursault in Camus' The Stranger, our patients are in a psychic prison, not wanting to reveal this part of their life. Some have even forgotten about it. Next section is called A Stranger Called Change. Unconscious fantasies are in an anomalous position when considering the theory and technique of psychoanalytic treatment. As they have a remarkable influence on people's lives, unconscious fantasies are, as Arlo has said in 1985, the subject of psychoanalytic investigation. Yet such a position can be misleading in that dominant unconscious fantasies that are useful for patients to know are the result of considerable psychoanalytic work before the direct interpretation of these fantasies. We tend to forget what scary strangers these fantasies are to our analytic traveling companion. Throughout his life, our companion has found stunningly brilliant and intricate ways to gratify these fantasies while keeping them separated from any conscious awareness. In this realm, much of his psychic life is devoted to avoid knowing of his psychic life. Thus, how we help patients to know is as important as helping them to know what they need to know. It is this point which is at the center of a technique based on talking with strangers. Now I'm going to present some clinical material that will describe this way of working that I've evolved to deal with this particular issue of talking with strangers. And that'll be followed by another case, not mine, in which there is a problem in the way the strangers are talked about. Anne is a 34-year-old unmarried business executive in 5 times per week psychoanalysis. She came into treatment depressed and in a fury after she found out that her last boyfriend had an affair while they were still going out. All her relationships sounded like guerrilla warfare. At first, it wasn't clear why Anne was coming to treatment, as she presented her problems as primarily external. While Anne had a number of long-term relationships, each one ended in mutual suspicion and plots of destruction. What sparked Anne's interest and led me to suggest analysis was her tentative exploration of lifelong feelings of inadequacy, deprivation, and anger. This is not the usual part of what I think is important to bring in a case history, but in this case it has a relevance for later on. During the analysis we learned Anne had never experienced orgasm except through self-stimulation. She had masturbated from a very early age and believed a man couldn't satisfy her any better than she could satisfy herself. Her strongly held belief was that the distance between her clitoris and vaginal opening was so large that she couldn't experience clitoral stimulation when being penetrated by a man. However, Anne had never sought examination to see if this was true and avoided gynecological exams altogether. When Anne eventually dared to be examined by a gynecologist, the findings were that everything seemed quite in line with what might be expected in normality. The analysis was filled with accusations and feelings of deprivation. These had been understood in part as a repetition of unconscious fantasies involving self-object and object relationships, especially lifelong feelings of mother's coldness and a sexually stimulating sadomasochistic relationship with her father. In the 3rd year of analysis, she met a man, Gary, with whom she seemed to be having an interesting and enjoyable relationship, and a sexual life characterized by her as more wild and active than ever before. She was still not able to have orgasm except orgasm through intercourse, and was angry about it. In the analysis, she remarked, she remained, for the most part, difficult, although there were increasing incidents where I could sense her warmth, humor, intelligence, and even her erotic excitement with me. In the days leading up to the session I will present, Anne was in a panic, which was unusual for her at this time in the treatment. She was having problems with a newly purchased computer. She was told by the manufacturer it was a modem problem and to return it for free repair or a new computer. Anne saw her panic in the following manner. Gary, her boyfriend, had installed new programs in the computer, and she felt this would be apparent when she returned it. She was convinced this would lead to an invalidation of the manufacturer's warranty. Anne was angry with Gary as she felt he put something in the computer that she didn't want and would have no use for whatsoever. Anne imagined the manufacturer as furious with anyone who would dare to put unauthorized programs into their computers. For a number of sessions, these were presented not as thoughts or imaginings, but as a reality that she was going to be forced to deal with. Thus Anne eagerly tells me of this bothersome stranger, the new program Gary put in which made her feel panicky, while seeing the cause of her panic as external. She's not asking for help when she tells this story, and she's told stories in this manner many times before. The panic, as reality-based, seems very important for her to hold on to. We begin to suspect in situations like this that one purpose of telling the story is to eject the stranger who is threatening to come into the compartment. While ostensibly the story is about our trained companion's unwanted program, the telling itself seems to assuage other feelings. Sitting across from such a person on a train journey, we sense we are being told to take a sympathetic role with an inherent demand that we accept the panic also as a reality. Any expression of interest in this stranger threatens to bring it into the compartment, exactly where Anne doesn't want it. Thus, as analysts, we are faced with the problem of how to work with somebody in a panic who doesn't seem to want our help, except in carefully delineated ways. Understanding itself seems to bring increased panic. The analytic work with a patient like Anne in such a situation begins, I think, with helping her see how threatened she is by knowing more about this stranger. Here's the vignette. Anne. Well, I finally was able to go to the computer store and was given a new computer. No questions asked. The clerk told me the manufacturer was having problems with this model, but it showed up inconsistently. I was so relieved. I can see how frightened I get when I'm imagining something. It's really terrible. It just demonstrates how much I don't want to be irritated by men. In fact, I had a lot of trouble remembering what you said yesterday. It allowed me to get to the store, but the rest is lost. I feel so irritated. Why can't I just use men and not have them be so irritating? Anne then went into a very lengthy explanation as how she meant the word use in its best sense. I said to her, after she talked about this in a long time, you spend some time amending the word use, as if to make it very clear to me your thought of wanting to just use men doesn't fit you. Okay, I'm going to talk now about this intervention and why. And here we see that the stranger entering the analytic compartment is irritating to Anne. At first glance, it seems to be a man. I don't want to be irritated by men. In fact, because of difficulties with lubrication, Anne often literally felt irritated during intercourse. Another stranger then enters, which irritates Anne, her wish to use men without their being irritating. Subsumed under this irritation are others. Her friend who put the program into the computer guy who'll find out about these unauthorized programs, her analyst whose input she already got rid of. Anne is also momentarily irritated with herself for approaching this wish to use men. The compartment suddenly feels very crowded. Anne finds herself in the middle, looking for a way out. As we have the best opportunity, I feel, to help patients observe conflicts as they happen in the analytic moment, this is the best time, I think, to explore this conflict in action. What I mean by observe a conflict as it happens is when Anne says, why can't I just use men? And then she stops and says, use in the best sense. So at that moment, you see. She at some level realizes that that this sentence, "Why can't I just use men?" is something that she doesn't want to get into, and she immediately amends it to say use in the best sense. That's what I mean by conflict in action. It's at these moments, I think, is the ideal time to bring something like this to a patient's attention, to show the conflict. It's concrete, it's observable to both of us. It's not something hypothesized about what's going on. It's something observable right there. We have often tended to overlook that patient's thinking in the middle of conflict is often pre-operational in a Piagetian sense, very concrete, and limited to the observable. My initial purpose is to see if Anne can acknowledge the conflict, to see if she's first able to observe herself struggling with this particular stranger without immediate enmeshment back in the conflict, that is, finding my remark irritating. That is, first, before going any further with this conflict or interpreting it or trying to help her understand it, I think first we have to see if a patient can sit with it for a moment without getting enmeshed right back in it with the person who's bringing it to her attention. Excuse me. At this moment, the meaning of content takes a back seat to the meaning of the process. There is little room for meaning if the patient needs to strongly believe what she's doing has no meaning, and thus experiences the analyst's interpretation of meaning as the problem rather than the symptom. The patient's affect becomes understandable only in the context of the defended against wish. Thus, the place to start, at least for me, is with the difficulty to own the wish. Once we point to the conflict, we follow the patient's lead in determining which aspect, if any, is more available to awareness. We tell this by the associations that follow. We have to act as a container of the patient's many feelings to see what it is that she's ready to own. What about the possible transference implications? As Anne's awareness of her irritation at not being able to just use men is being defended against, there's little use in linking her irritation to me. First, we need to work with the resistance to accepting her irritation, that she can't simply use men, and the causes for it, before interpreting and exploring her irritation in the transference. Returning briefly to the situation on the train, does it make sense to try and shove more strangers into the compartment while our companion is trying to kick them out? Okay, that's a long diversion as to what my comment was about. So let me remind you what I said. I said you spend some time amending the word use as if to make it clear to me your thought of wanting to use men doesn't fit you, except in the best sense. Anne says, yes, that's true. I found myself thinking of Jessica and Michael, an old boyfriend and his first wife. I remembered her saying that Michael and I were users. I didn't really think that was the case. Anne then went on to talk of all the normal ways one would need to use a man. They're bigger, stronger, for things like cutting down trees, opening jar lids, hunting for food in an earlier time, etc. I said to her, you seem to be back to the word use in the best sense. Again, returning to the conflict over accepting this word. Just some brief comments. In this, Anne briefly allows Jessica and Michael into the compartment to claim some space. However, Anne then summarily kicks them out the door, along with Jessica's ideas that she and Michael were users. Anne returns to her former position, her difficulty in exploring her user thoughts, that is, her reluctance to approach the stranger. Thus, a brief spark of interest in the stranger, being a user, is quickly retreated from. My intervention is again directed to that moment when Anne becomes resistant to her user feelings. I point out again something happened at this moment and implicitly ask, is there some part of this that you can think about? Leaving it to Anne as to which part, if any, she can explore. Anne. Jessica actually got it all wrong. She thought I was using Michael for social privilege, his being a respected professor at a prestigious graduate school. What she didn't know is that I had grown up in privileged positions throughout my life. Here Anne is referring to a father being a somewhat prominent lawyer. So I didn't need Michael's privilege. I said then. So the idea of using men was amended because it implied you might need a man for something, and you felt you already had everything you needed. Anne then said, I see what you mean. I said, like the manufacturers you were convinced would be angry if anyone thought their machines needed anything. Anne, with a sense of weariness and intensely felt emotion, which was somewhat rare. Someday, she said, I wish I could relax, not feel like I had to do everything for myself. There was a brief pause. I don't know what's going on. Sometimes when you talk to me, I just feel very good. I'm feeling and seeing something I had no idea of. It's incredible how off I can be. Okay. The unconscious fantasy emerges of having it all and not needing a man for anything. This was one stranger kept as a background reality with rage at anyone who challenged it. The rage was then projected onto the manufacturers. After my interpretation of this, we see Anne allowing in a more challenging stranger, her longing for a man who would help her. At this point, Anne does not defend against the wish and can even allow herself to feel this directly in relationship to me. While similar things had emerged, that is the fantasy of having it all, it was never spelled out so clearly at this time. But I want to remind you, it was my attempt to work, with Anne's pulling back from meaning. It was the pulling back from meaning, rather than hypothesizing meaning, that allowed for the elaboration of the unconscious fantasy. It was not the work of a single session, but years of working in this way that allowed Anne to approach this fantasy. It was a fantasy which needed to be kept a stranger to protect Anne's self-esteem. Anne's feelings at the end of the session were expressed with an openness and lack of posturing unusual for her. It beautifully expresses her confusion. What is going on when a man offers her something that feels good and she feels is offered kindly? It is her psychoanalytic achievement that she's able to experience these feelings and ask the question. Next, I would like to talk about a case presented, it's in the literature by Elizabeth Botsbelius, and I call this section The Battle with Strangers. In contrast, let me express an example of clinical work based upon what Paniagua has called topographically inspired technique. I chose it because while admiring of the analyst's clinical acumen, and I've been in a number of workshops with Elizabeth, who's a Kleinian, and she's a very astute clinician, but her method of interpretation demonstrates the degree to which there are significant differences in talking with strangers. Picking up in the middle of a session the week before the analyst's vacation, the patient mentions being pleased to have found a nice cleaning woman. The analyst said, "The good cleaning woman was perhaps a substitute for the bad analyst. who wasn't going to be cleaning her up during the holidays. The patient then described redecorating her bathroom, her loo, and described in detail her plan to buy a mahogany seat. The analyst said, "The loo here does not have a mahogany seat, but there is one room in here where there is a lot of mahogany." "Oh," said the patient, "you mean here in this room?" She looked carefully around the room. "Yes," she said, "this room is full of mahogany." The analyst then said, "When you stress that your loo seat is to be made of mahogany, it's as if you are shifting the mahogany from the consulting room into the loo." "Oh," she said. The analyst then said, "I felt as if I was spelling things out to an interested but rather bewildered child." Was she really so unaware of what she was saying? I wondered to myself. Or had I confronted her too brusquely? It was one of the few occasions up to this point that I was aware of the obliviousness that she said sometimes people complained about. And so I went on. "You're putting the consulting room into the loo, flushing me and your analysis away. I'm the much valued cleaner, but when it's the last week of the sessions, I'm flushed away." In this example, every utterance of the patient is perused for its symbolic, unconscious transference implications. The main problem is that the analyst then interprets to the patient as if these potential symbols of the transference were the same as conscious references to the treating analyst. There seems to be less attention to the readiness of the patient to hear and understand the analyst's interpretation of the possible symbolic meaning of what the patient may be saying. The analyst's ability to read the symbols becomes confused with the patient's ability to understand. This paves the way for the patient to seem like a bewildered child. It is striking that even after the analyst senses that the patient doesn't understand, she continues to interpret deeply. The analyst not only pushes these strangers into the room, she also deprives the patient of hosting them. While the analyst interprets the patient's wish to flush her away, the analyst seems to push aside that part of the patient's mind responsible for integrating and synthesizing interpretations. What is treated by the patient as menacing strangers is treated by the analyst as long-lost friends. While the patient reacts to her own material like someone walking resolutely through an unfamiliar neighborhood, the analyst responds as a knowledgeable tour guide on a sightseeing visit to familiar territory. There are, of course, times when we say things to patients we know are not greeted as old friends. However, with preparatory work, such interpretation should appear to the patient as an unpleasant acquaintance avoided for years, the kind of person one sees entering the same train we're on, and we wait to see where they seat themselves before taking our own seat quite at a distance. The reacquaintance with the stranger is unpleasant, but not menacing. Talking with strangers in the role of the ego. Let me just see if I'm going to... I'll just read a little bit of this theoretical section. Kernberg, who may or may not be my good friend after lunch, recently pointed out the significant revival of the importance of the ego for psychoanalytic technique amongst English-speaking analysts, especially the contemporary Freudians in the United States and the contemporary Kleinians in London. In the clinical examples just presented, I have laid out some principles on which a contemporary Freudian approach to the clinical material and how it still may be very different from a London Kleinian point of view. It's my impression that the clinical technique of the Kleinians has not caught up for their appreciation for the inclusiveness of the ego. Their technique still seems based more on battling with strangers rather than talking with strangers. It's my impression that the contemporary Kleinians are struggling with their early heritage when it was believed in order to establish and sustain the analytic situation, analysts must give deep interpretations that locate the deepest level of anxiety. It's a quote from Bob Hinshelwood in his dictionary of Kleinian concepts. It's fascinating to me. I've been on a couple of panels with Betty Joseph and Michael Feldman, a current group of Kleinians from London who are being compared to the ego psychologist, and while they say many of the same words about only approaching patients where they can hear things and that sort of thing, that when you actually then hear what they say, it's not as bad as it used to be, but it's still usually very deep interpretations, and it's based upon a whole different view of what helps people to get better. I don't know how much Kleinian thinking is talked about here, but in Boston it's a hot topic, and it's very important in the American psychoanalytic also. But I was speaking, Bob Hinshelwood and I were on a panel together, and we were talking, and he told me something that I think isn't well known, and that is that the psychoanalysts in England see the most disturbed patients. The health service takes all the healthier patients, and the untreatable patients then go to the Kleinians. So that their theory is really based on working with extremely disturbed patients. And I'm not sure that validates it, but it certainly means it's difficult to compare with the American tradition of in the 50s and 60s of working with more neurotic or moderately disturbed character disorders. They're talking about working with very severe character disorders. So let me read you a little bit about the consciousness. It is striking how little attention psychoanalysis or psychoanalysts have paid to the role of consciousness as part of the change process in psychoanalysis. What the Nobel laureate neuroscientist Eric Kandel has called one of the great mysteries of science, the nature of consciousness, and has been the subject of intensive scrutiny for the past 15 years amongst neuroscientists, cognitive psychologists, and philosophers of science. Consciousness has been almost totally ignored in the psychoanalytic literature. It is my impression that many psychoanalysts consider consciousness as an epiphenomenon. That is, consciousness happens as the result of other things going on in the analysis, not as a result of any specific focus in theory or technique. Some do not consider consciousness as worthy of psychoanalytic scrutiny. It's my position that inherent in every interpretation of the unconscious in clinical psychoanalysis is an implied definition of psychoanalytic consciousness. Whenever we interpret something unknown to a patient, we express our belief it is knowable. Can any psychoanalyst imagine a position where we think that for the majority of psychoanalytic patients, It's a good idea to leave at the level of unconsciousness, unconscious fantasies that are causing major symptoms in a patient's life. Every interpretation is an attempt to bring something from the unconscious closer to the surface of the mind. Yet we have spent little time in considering the specifics of how to do this, leaving us with the vagaries of tact and timing. We tend to forget that the most frightening aspect of the psychoanalytic treatment is for the patient to consciously know or sense he is becoming aware of the specifics of unconscious fantasies and how these are gratified. Feelings of humiliation over what he has done in order to gain love or power. How the people he's needed to idealize are not that ideal, and the people he's hated he's also loved. The list goes on. Some patients are afraid to know they know anything, while protesting they know everything. From Freud onward, we have seen that the purpose of defensive processes are to take the meaning out of behavior dominated by unconscious fantasies. In this way, fantasies can be lived out with any conscious knowledge. Fantasies have an active, ongoing influence on behavior, while the individual has no understanding of their meaning and the fantasies driving them. Thus, the critical accomplishments of defenses is the establishment of a barrier between living out unconscious fantasies and conscious understanding. Conscious knowing, in a psychoanalytic sense, is not the same as perception or knowing in its colloquial meaning. We may make an interpretation to a patient that is deeply unconscious, and the patient may now know this about himself. But this is very different than the patient experiencing the interpretation as a way of knowing himself. To state it in its most pithy form, psychoanalytic consciousness involves the potential for awareness of the role of one's own mind in affecting life in and outside of the psychoanalytic office. Psychoanalytic consciousness is not something static, but a highly variegated gradation, beginning with an inkling, a dim awareness that there's a lot going on in one's mind. I'm going to skip this next theoretical section where I talk about the role of more about the preconscious and resistance analysis and free association. At the end of the road, or the end of the ride, within our model of the mind, the strangers we attempt to introduce to our patients lead a double life. From the side of the unconscious ego, these are familiar adversaries that it has dealt with for years, primarily via defenses and compromise formations. From the side of the conscious ego, these are dangerous strangers threatening to cause psychic mayhem. From this perspective, let us consider the changes that can take place in psychoanalysis. The patient who flies into rages becomes aware of intense feelings of needfulness for which he feels unconsciously guilty. Therefore, whenever he starts to feel needful, he becomes furious with the person who makes him feel this way. Analysis leads to greater acceptance into consciousness of the needful side of him, leading him to feel less angry. The depressed, self-hating patient becomes aware of how he's internalized his anger towards others, and with greater acceptance of his anger into consciousness, he feels less depressed. These examples typify what has always been the sine qua non of the psychoanalytic method: increased tolerance for fantasies and feelings that are being defended against. One way to think about the psychoanalytic method is that it's about freedom of the mind, the freedom to think, the freedom to feel. As I believe conflict is never obliterated, but its intensity is significantly decreased, patients are helped most, I think, by ongoing access to their own mind. At the end of our analytic train ride, our companion should no longer be afraid of the strangers in his mind. When the exigencies of life lead to the inevitable arousal of conflict, we should have helped our companion to not be afraid to meet old and new strangers. We do this best if, from the beginning of treatment, we recognize and appreciate the complexity of not only getting to know these strangers, but also learning how to talk with them. Thanks.
Do you have comments or questions? I'd like to make a comment about the paper from the standpoint of how we evaluate clinical evidence. It's something that I've been interested in, as you know.
John taught a course on this at the Michigan Cyclic for many years.
The point I would like to make about your particular clinical example is that I think it's extremely helpful to present clinical material in such a close way, because it then gives the audience a chance then to see whether the assertions that you're making fit in any way with the detailed clinical information that you give them. It seems to me that there is a close fit between what you were trying to demonstrate theoretically and the particular dialogue that you entered into with her. But others are free to disagree with that. But you provided the opportunity to have that kind of discussion based on what happened. In particular, I think you have demonstrated within the criteria that you set that you can demonstrate a change in her in the course of your talking to her, okay? And you've defined the particular criteria that you would consider to be a positive change in her. Okay. Then there's a problem that arises when you want to compare and contrast your technique with someone else's technique. And here I felt that the Kleinian example, while but from the standpoint of clinical evidence, if you had continued, and maybe it was not available, to do the same thing with the Kleinian material as with yours, to see what was the effect, we would assume, based on our clinical theory, that there would have been some kind of effect that would show up in the ensuing material of the analyst continuing to interpret deeply, despite the fact that she felt that the patient wasn't understanding her. Okay, and that ought to be accessible and could be demonstrated in the same way. Then the comparative question about technique could be answered based not on our preferences, not on our training analysis or anything else, but it could be decided more on the basis of what is the effect of a particular technique on patients. I wonder what you thought about that.
That's a very good point, and thank you for your thoughts on it, Tom. And I appreciate it very much. I know how much you've thought about this issue of clinical evidence. And I agree with you. I demanded of myself, I demanded of my candidates that the only way you can really tell anything about what's going, if you're going to have any chance about finding anything about what's going on in the clinical hour, you have to have as much as possible of what goes on in that session in order to follow. When I say X, what happens?
Yeah.
What happens at that moment? I don't think there's any other way to understand what's going on in a clinical interaction. Yeah, I did this mainly for a matter of space and time, to not...
Like anything else, clients do certain things very well. And there are things that they don't do as well. Some of us will think, maybe we're wrong, But they are very good, for example, at dealing with unconscious fantasies. They pursue that like a dog pursues a bone hidden in the ground and won't give it easily, and because they tend to do that, and that is very important to them, then they tend to become sometimes a little wild about their interpretations. In other words, the problem with that is that sometimes you pass your own fantasies to the fantasies of the patient, and it's very difficult to distinguish which is, and that's where the problem of clinical evidence is really very significant. Is the thought, or is it but don't make the mistake of assuming that all Kleinian things are bad. They're not. They have a lot of very good people, and there are certain things that they did to a degree of excellence that was tremendous. There are other things that you wouldn't, somebody with my training and inclination and experience may not agree with. But so, in any case, the subject of unconscious fantasies is important, and it applies to this paper as indeed it applies to any analytic patient that you may have. And it's interesting because there are many types of unconscious fantasies. The one that are of particular interest, and I think in this case is very visible, that is the ones that are unconscious ego fantasies. So these are not repressed fantasies. In other words, they have been sent into the age where the rule that dominates the field is primary process, and the fantasy gets disorganized and in a way destroyed. In the unconscious ego, there is secondary process thinking, and many fantasies that start at a particular point in a patient then develop in the unconscious ego by means of secondary process in all kinds of ways, and this case is a very good example of that. Now, when you say, I know that Fred is trying to illustrate a particular way of approaching the patient and using your intervention, but what you do, what you say to the patient or what the patient reaction is partly too related to what the content is that is being hidden behind these different derivatives, which are far away, really, some distance from the original problem and conflict. For example, with this patient, and I don't know, you may have a lot of information, I know you were not trying to refer to that, but to me, what this patient says is very typical of things that we are very familiar with. For example, she says she has it all, having it all, she doesn't need a man. Well, that very clear is a childhood fantasy that she owns a penis. Only that is hidden, it's inside her, and at some point will grow out or whatever the fantasy is. Now, that's a substantial fantasy, and I'm sure he has elaborated himself in the unconscious secondary process way that these things happen in any number of ways, and extended itself everywhere. But essentially, that woman can tolerate the penis inside of her. She can lubricate, because essentially she thinks she's a boy, and so she doesn't. She can behave like a woman. She can lubricate. She cannot accept a penis in there. It doesn't do anything for her in there. What is hidden is the fantasy of possessing a penis. That's what is hidden, I think, in this particular patient. It's interesting because, and that's why she resents Gary, which is, I believe, a displacement from the transference to the analyst. In this sense, she says that Gary is putting programs in her computer that don't belong there. Well, let's translate that into, this thing that I was telling you earlier, vagina and things of that kind. And so Gary is being an intruder. And so is the analyst, who is putting things in her computer that she doesn't want to have there. So your interpretations are like a penetration. And when you have a patient that has this type of thing, what you tell her and how you tell her is important, obviously, and I think that's the point that Fred was trying to illustrate, how you approach this more from an ego-psychological side to try and help the patient see it. But you see, it's not enough, in my view, to do that. You have to be very close to the target of what the unconscious fantasy is behind what you're trying to uncover or help the patient to think about. And if you are not nearby or have not prepared the ground enough for her to have some idea that what she's talking about is the fact that she has from childhood, very likely it's a common, practical universal fantasy, that they had it, they may grow at some point or may not. I had a patient, which I have referred to you sometimes in England, that used to, when she was a little girl, she used to go to every visitor that came to the house with her picture. It was a picture of a little girl, and she would tell them, this is the way I look now. But then she got another picture that was a male cousin. You could see his penis. Yeah. A little boy, tall. And she would say, but this is the way I'm going to become later. You see what I mean? And of course, that was repressed. When I saw that patient, she didn't have any knowledge of that. But she did have a lot of difficulties in her relationship to males, because she could not totally accept her femininity. And that was based on a variety, as it always is, of many reasons. Obviously, not uncommonly, people want as a first child a boy, and that creates problems and things of that kind. And she would have wanted to be a boy to please her father, and all kinds of things are complicated developing in early childhood are in there. But you have to be close to that target. Otherwise, you are firing shots in the dark, really. And the patient can follow you no matter how well you approach it, whether it is ego-wise or with interpretation, how you try to help them to think about the problem. You have to have prepared the ground to some degree of what it is that they are dealing with. If they are that far away, they may never be able to see, they may not be able to follow you. So it is important to be close to the target when you are attempting to do these things, and I know that Fred knows that very well and does that very well himself. So, but the other issue that is interesting, and I don't know, you may want to comment on that, how much opportunity you have, because in a way, that's like a character. We were discussing here with the students the other day, character disorders, and what I call character defenses. And that's what this woman has. She has developed an attitude which is now part of her character, which is a particular way of thinking about men and related to men. And consequently, that's not permeable any longer to any interpretation until you deal with the character resistance, which is a way that she has of avoiding really looking at the problem that is behind it. You see what I mean? And we were talking about that, and you can see that very clearly in this patient. Until you deal with that in some form and become aware of it, you are going to have some difficulties in getting into what is behind the character resistance that she has developed. And it's not an ordinary resistance like things that are repressed. It's something bigger and more difficult to deal than that, because they can dismiss you real easily. I don't know how much chance Fred had with this patient to discuss the fact that he was a stranger intruding into her space and moving. It's like a Gary was putting things inside a computer. He too, you too were putting things inside a computer.
Constantly.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to hear a bit about that, and then relate that to how you help them with that particular technique that you are describing, that particular approach that you are describing.
Well, you better have given me a book to talk about. Let's see. Just to pick up on the issue of the clients, I think also what the clients are good at, and which I think we were not very good at in my own training, was to be very sensitive to the most disturbed parts of patients. That they can see the confusion that patients experience and are frightened of. That in my own training we tended to see more as regressions, primarily regressions from higher levels of being, rather than a more primitive part of the patient that may be feeling extremely confused or disintegrated or in danger of falling apart. That's probably one of most of our patients. So they are experts at that, and I feel like I've learned a lot from them about that particular perspective. I'm not surprised that John thought Derek Miller was a Kleinian, because the middle schoolers often seem more Kleinian than Kleinians. Yeah, basically much more influenced by Kleinians. But and a lot of their thinking is also developed around Winnicott's work. Yeah. In terms of the unconscious fantasy, what this paper is about is helping the patient to see and understand and appreciate the ways in which the unconscious fantasies are these strangers that are kicked out of the room. That until you can help the patient see that they're kicking all these things out and they don't want them to be a part of them, then I think interpreting the unconscious fantasy tends not to be as helpful. But I agree also, but I think we've always been very good at this, understanding unconscious fantasies in all their depth. And I agree that this was one part of what I said was one part of her unconscious fantasy. I mean, I thought I was alluding to that, and it's something that we had talked about at length in the treatment as one part of her, that for a variety of reasons, it was humiliating to feel like a woman. That in part, the only one that seemed to be an alive person in her house, she was an only child, only seemed alive, was her father. Her mother was a very depressed, very narcissistic person, so that to be a woman was a very damaged, humiliated place to be, and to be more like a man gave you much more life, and there were other factors also.
That's what you call being complete.
Pardon me?
Being a man was being
Being complete, yeah.
That's what you wanted to be, complete.
And indeed, much of the treatment, for a long time, almost anything I would say would be rejected. Yeah, it was irritating to her. It was very, very difficult for her to take in something from me. And when she did take in something from me for a long time, she took in something from me, and she really was able to use it for a little bit. It would make her depressed. And then she would go back to her other way of being. So, working all of this, going over this again and again and again became an important part of the treatment. Yeah, you had a question?
It's really about technique. No, it is a question. It seems to me that you talked about two strangers, one that she was letting in and one that she wasn't letting in. The one she seemed to be letting in was the word irritated, which you've used again and again, even as you talk about her now. And then the one she wasn't letting in was using. And I'm wondering about the choice to pursue the resistance versus the one that she seemed to be willing to explore, or even demanding, it seems like, in her language to explore. Just the word irritating, which to me seems to bring up all kinds of fantasies just as well, and to match with the whole computer scenario.
Very good question. This is how I would understand it. That she could talk about being irritated till the cows came home. and be very comfortable with it. And with those people out there, so irritated her. And there was no conflict, particular about that. That's what happened from the time she came into my office. But it was being irritated over being able to use men where the conflict expressed itself, where she had to take it back. So that's the reason for dealing with the irritation over using rather than the irritation itself. Because if I would bring up irritation, she would say, of course I'm irritated, this jerk or this jerk. But it's the using men that she, at that moment, just at that moment, she had a conflict with that. So we could approach the issue of being irritated, but not being able to use men. That's why the choice of that point. Please.
Fred, we will have to stop, otherwise there is another
one more question.
The last question then we will take 10-15 minutes and we'll go into the next. Some people probably have things to do in the afternoon.
Let me clarify one point. I'm not sure about how you see this. It sounds as if at times the interpretation of the defense that you're referring to as opposed to the content of the unconscious wish, is this a means to the end? Are you seeing it and constructing it as, this is the place to start, but ultimately your goal is to do the content interpretations of the wish themselves? Or is this an end to itself in the sense that you might stay at this level, and if it's the former, if it's just a means to the second, to get to the content, or when they can hear the interpretations of the unconscious fantasy, then it seems to me that different patients come in at different levels of thinking. That's just my own clientele, that there are some that those defense interpretations seem to be critically the way to go because nothing else can be done initially. But there are some that the stranger is like so much a part of their conscious experience already. And so in that case, do you still work in the same direction, starting with the kind of defensive interpretation, or do you might start much earlier with some of the content?
Very good question again. I don't see the defense interpretations as a means themselves. I have a difference with some people about this. Some people think if you keep on making defense interpretations, eventually the patient's going to get to something themselves. I don't believe that. I think it's a means both to learn about characteristic ways in which people keep themselves inhibited about knowing things, which is part of it. It's just that it's useful information for people to have, but also as a means to get into all the other fantasies. I would suggest that if somebody comes in with something, it isn't really a stranger. It's not a stranger to them. It's not something that they're putting up. It's something, and oftentimes it's the narcissistic issues. They're the ones people come in most comfortable with. My lousy boss. I'm not getting enough attention. I'm not getting enough appreciation. I've been cared enough about, and those are often easily linked to various childhood experiences that I think people are I'll get into this actually in the next paper. People are very ready to accept and appreciate, and it's very easy to talk about. But I think those kinds of issues, not the deeper narcissistic influence, but those kinds of issues that people come in with, I think are necessary and important to talk about right away, because they're not particularly defended against. What might be defended against is more the feelings of shame and humiliation that they've done something to cause this to happen, those sorts of things.
All right, let's take 15 minutes and then come back.